90% of the users take 3 hours from the time they add a product to the cart to the time they make the final purchase. If the user is not really making the purchase even after 3 hours, does it mean should I intervene? As a brand, should I tell them about, hey, most of the people already shop by this time. If you're taking longer, can I help you? Or is there something which is a relevant communication, but it just drives back the intent for these users?
Welcome friends to the Growth Genius podcast powered by Infidigit. My name is Kaushal Thakkar. I am the founder of Infidigit and your host for this show. Each week, I interview geniuses who have created phenomenal digital growth. We discuss the key techniques and share insights to help you learn and create your own growth story. Many Indians witnessed a really fast transition from feature phones to smartphones. With around 400 million smartphone users, we are the nation with the second largest number of smartphone users just behind China. However, China is far ahead with almost double the number of smartphone users. Considering these two countries have almost the same population, India will be at par with China soon. It means in the coming years, we are going to witness a 100% growth in smartphone users, and this will lead to an increase in the usage of apps on smartphones. Today, we are going to discuss the topic, apps growth and its future in India. And we have with us a growth genius from Google who will be sharing the insights related to apps with us. Join me in welcoming Rajat Srivastava, who leads the app product and portfolio for Google's large customers in India. He drives the go-to-market strategy and product adaptation for all new product and feature launches around the app campaigns. Let's learn more about apps from this growth genius from Google. So Rajat, how could a brand initiate their app journey?
That's a good question, Kaushal. And I think what we're seeing now is more and more brands who are not looking at app as their reach strategy are now considering it because offline and other mediums are a little limited. So I think the first thing to understand is business first, which is what is the use case that you're trying to solve for your consumers and how does app help answer those questions? The second is really the development nuances to it. So how do you get started? And once you have the use cases defined and you have the UI and the UX flows defined, then really it's about the development itself. Typically in India, if you're starting off, Android is the preferred platform if your use case is to reach out to masses. And iOS is a different user set, but it's also premium users comparatively. So depends on what you want to prioritize as a brand. I think from there, the first step is to start with the development itself. And of course, there are Google tools available like Firebase that help you across the journey of development of your app. So speaking more about Firebase, for example, it's a free tool that provides 3 broad use cases. The first use case is around how do you build better apps. And that includes solutions like hosting, cloud storage, machine learning modules that you might want to use later for personalization and so on. Once you have the basics in place, then you want to improve the quality of the foundation, which is where you look at features like Crashlytics, where you understand in what scenarios could your app not be working the way as intended. Or you could look at app distribution modules where you want to release the app to a limited set of users, get their feedback, understand and build a minimum viable product before releasing it to everyone else. And the third step is really to grow your business, which is a lot around marketing and making sure that you have, let's say, the in-app messaging piece is solved for your consumers. You have the Google Analytics built in where you understand the user behavior. And you also have features like A/B testing and dynamic links that enable you to make your marketing more effective.
Perfect. And a user would be able to use some of these features and maybe use some other utility or other tools for some of these features?
That's right. Yes. So I think these are all independent modules and you could pick and choose from the selection available to the ones that most suit your need. And of course, you could choose to go with a different solution as well if you think there's a better alternative as well.
So a different development environment, that's what you're referring to.
Correct. That's right.
And integrate Firebase for something like an analytics or something like that.
Yes. So I think of these 3 buckets, which is either making better apps or improving the quality of the app or growing your business, you could pick and choose specific modules that mean the most to you. For example, there are a lot of new features around Firebase, which will improve the performance of your paid acquisition campaign. So if you're spending money to acquire users, it would improve the quality of those users as well.
Oh, nice. That's good. And Rajat, one other question which comes out over there is for many apps, the development of the environment is already done. So they have already built the app on some other technology or some other platform. but they want to use Google Analytics or let's say Firebase Analytics. So do you think for those users directly integrating Google Analytics, the app segment of Google Analytics, is that a better option, or should they use Firebase in such cases?
Firebase has now become the de facto platform for everything on apps. While Google Analytics itself has been around, I think Firebase is the platform that I would recommend for our users, everything to do with apps.
True. And in such cases, the analytics of, let's say, the web and the app, if somebody wants a 360-degree view, they should be able to get a 360-degree view even in such a case when they're using Google Analytics for maybe their web plus Firebase for their app.
Yes, so I think there is a new feature that has recently been launched, which is called App plus Web Properties within Firebase, which allows you to do exactly that. Right? All of our consumers and we as users are really moving towards multiple platforms. We would either start a journey of a transaction or a content view on one and really complete it on the other. And that decision cycle can span multiple touch points. And an app plus web view, for example, helps you get a unified view there.
Great. And the next question which comes over there, Rajat, would be, let's say the user developed the app, and now the next stage, once the app is developed and they've integrated Firebase, etc., the next question which comes, how do you gain more installs? How do you gain more users on the app? Any advice for the users who want to get more app installs?
Yes, so I think broadly there are about 5 or 6 sources that you can think of from where your users can come from, right? And the first way a user could come to the app is organically. So I already, let's say, know about an Amazon or a Flipkart app. I go to the Play Store directly. I download the app directly from there. I know about the brand. And this takes years of efforts or brand building activity to be really known at scale, and which is where it works wonderfully for larger brands. But for smaller developers and people who are starting off, organic presence or may not be as much, which is where you have to really depend on the other channels. Of course, the other one, which is the most commonly used, is your paid acquisition channel. So you have app install campaigns that you can run on a Google or a Facebook or affiliate network partners, and they will deliver to the outcomes that you have defined at a certain threshold. So for example, speaking for Google app campaigns, it's actually a machine learning, completely automated campaign, which you just set a goal of a CPI, or which is a cost per install, or a cost per action, let's say like a cost per registration. And you give the creatives and the machine learning algorithms get you the users within those boundaries. So it's a completely automated solution, works very well for people who are starting off fresh or don't have the resources to invest in marketing. The third bucket really is around referrals. If you remember, let's say if I refer Kaushal gets certain points, I also get a benefit. And that's where virality and word of mouth become important. And this goes back to not only apps, but if you remember, OnePlus, when they launched, had this whole invite model, which became really popular, right? Because there's a fear of missing out. You trust your friends, and when they recommend something, it's really, you take their word for it, and which is where referrals are also effective. The fourth is around CRM or your own media channels. Let's say I have a list of email IDs, or I have a list of phone numbers, or I have a list of users who I know I can reach out to and ask them to download my app. Let's say that's the fourth bucket, which is relevant. And there are two which are fairly new compared to the others, but are also gaining traction. Right? The fifth is really influencer marketing. So the term is new. Influencers have always been around. We know them as Bollywood and celebrities, and they've endorsed products for multiple years. Right? So when you see a Shah Rukh Khan advertising about a product, you certainly feel connected. The same way, there are thought influencers in each area, and they have a deeper following, and that's when you could use them as well for building awareness about your app. And the last is really around alliances or co-marketing, which is where two brands come together and offer sort of a barter or an exchange where, say, here's what I can offer to your users, which is complementary, and in return, this is what I get. So it's combining the efforts of two brands together to deliver results for both. So it's broadly a win-win, and those are 6 common ones.
Perfect. Let's say I buy a particular phone and a Facebook app comes pre-installed on that.
Right.
Or a Amazon app comes pre-installed on that. Would you term that as an affiliate or a co-marketing alliance?
So it would lie somewhere between a deal that you could strike with a brand. So let's say if you're speaking to an OEM manufacturer, you could tell them, this is what I want to pay for. So let's say I don't want to pay for every pre-burn that is done on the app, but I am willing to pay for every activation that happens or every registration that happens from the pre-burn. And I think that's where those models come into play. Those are, again, I think, seen more commonly for larger brands which want to reach out to masses, whereas the other mediums are more targeted and it's more relevant, and you're controlling who you want to reach out to.
Perfect. And while gaining the installs, many a time we see that there are many cases where while the app gets installed, but we do not see active users as many as the installs. Are there any things which we need to be aware of?
Yes, so I think wherever money is involved, fraud follows. And here's when I ask you back a question, Kaushal. Could you guess the amount of fraud that typically seen on app installs, let's say last year in India?
Not much aware about it, but maybe 20-30%.
Yeah, you are aware about it, Kaushal. So I think that's the right ballpark figure. It's about 30% of installs that you see are really fraud, which just means that, people might want to take credit for installs that never happened, and which is where it's a big challenge. I think if you talk to advertisers across the board, you would realize that there are certain sources which are comparatively cleaner. And this is where Google, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and so on are the more cleaner channels, whereas fraud is more commonly seen in affiliate networks and so on. That's the problem, because now you want to make sure that you are safeguarding yourself against potential fraud that might be happening, which is an overhead on your analytics platform. So always keep in mind to look for fraud signals if you are running paid campaigns.
Okay. And your fraud signals over here, other than, let's say, install happened, user did not come, are there any other way to understand what is happening over there in terms of fraud?
Yes. So I think there are multiple types of fraud here. The most common one is install hijacking. So let's say an install did happen, the user also came in, but the user was not really coming from the source who claims that the install has come from them, right? So let's say if I'm standing in a shopping queue and there's a person who's coming in the billing line, and I just say, hey, here's my coupon, use this to bill. Now, while what happens is for the retailer, he sees that, this person who gave the coupon influenced the decision. But really, the person was already in the shopping queue. He had made his decision to buy a product. So I'm just stealing the credit for this transaction, which is what happens on install hijacking as well. And there are multiple types of such cases, which is why being aware definitely helps. And there are a lot of industry reports that are useful to understand what are the common types of fraud. But typically what we recommend is to start off with using your own user base the best and the most effective way, then looking at safer channels. And if you're exhausting that, or if you feel that there are limits to the efficiency that you are seeing, there is when you open up beyond that.
Then you move to the other networks.
Correct.
Perfect. Fine. And once these users are acquired, let's say they are on a particular platform or a particular app, what would be the best way to retain those users? Because I see that also as a regular channel coming from many of our customers.
Absolutely. So we have to realize that as marketers, no matter how much blood, sweat, and tears we put in, the users may not stay back, right? And I think that's where it's really, for your geeky listeners, if I were to put it, it's the second law of thermodynamics, which basically says that there will always be some energy that gets lost. Now, what that means is we need to know, why should a user come back to the app? So if I'm a user, why should I come back and visit the app after a week or after 10 days? Right? And I think is freshness of the content driving me back to the app? So that, let's say, in the context of shopping, again, Flipkart and e-commerce apps like Amazon have these daily deals. So I shop for something yesterday, but I want to come back and see what's there today. Like what's the deals of the day today, or what's the lightning deal for today. And that's just, a way for me to come back and try the app. In some cases, like food delivery apps, Zomato and Swiggy, you have the use cases of repeat purchases. So I ordered a North Indian cuisine yesterday, but today I want to order Chinese.
Perfect.
And that's the repeat use case for that specific brand. And of course, brands like gaming and entertainment apps like Disney Plus and so on, by design, are meant to have multiple use cases within a day or within a week. So those are where you would really expect the users to come back often. On the other extremes are your apps like fintech apps, which provide loans, right? And if I've taken a loan today, it's very likely that I may not use the app really for the next few weeks or months also. And hence, in each of these 4 or 5 examples that we spoke about, what's important is to know what's the benchmark that your category has and how you are faring against. And then you really know that, are the users staying back, at least on an average, for how long they're staying back for the other apps within the same category.
Okay.
And I think just in terms of what do you do to make sure that your users really don't go away once you know those benchmarks, the first is to really identify key milestones in the user journey and prevent potential churn that might happen from each step. Okay. So let's again go back to the e-commerce example, because that's more easy for us to understand, right? Because we all shop online all the time. Let's say if I understand that 90% of the users take 3 hours. I'm just making these numbers up. 90% of the users take 3 hours from the time they add a product to the cart to the time they make the final purchase. Then if I see that the user is not really making the purchase even after those 3 hours, does it mean should I intervene? As a brand, should I tell them about, hey, most of the people already shop by this time. If you're taking longer, can I help you? Or is there something which you're stuck with? Or have you forgotten something which is a relevant communication, but it just drives back the intent for these users? And then, of course, so that's one which is commonly used through your push notifications and so on. And the other really is paid marketing again. So Google App Campaigns for Engagement, or ACE, is again a machine learning driven product which does the same automatically. So if you are a user who's one of these buckets which were engaging with the app earlier but are not, the app campaigns will target users like this across search, display, YouTube, and Google Play to drive you back to the app to complete the action or engage with the app again.
Great. That's nice. And any changes which you're seeing, Rajat? Now, let's say COVID has completely changed the behavior of many users. Anything which has changed drastically pre-COVID and during COVID in terms of apps, the behavior of the users?
So I think there are again two broad shifts that have happened. One is that there are a lot of net new users that we are seeing on the apps, right? And I'm sure all of us as listeners would agree that, let's say, our family members are using apps like Zoom or gaming like Ludo King. Or my dad, for example, makes his payments of electricity bills online on the app, which he's never done before, always used to be in queues and so on. So these are an entirely new set of users who have very different behavior from what we've seen earlier. And second is, even the user behavior of existing app users have changed. So essentials over everything else, which means that the way I engage with the app is again very different from what it was 5 months back or 6 months back. And that just makes lives of marketers a little more difficult because we've built understanding over time of what works and tweak that. And I think some of that may not be relevant in the current time. There's much higher volatility overall, which is where again I think dependence on automation and machine learning becomes important, because those signals are really adjusted in a much faster way through machine learning algo than a human being could ever do.
Perfect. That sounds good. Now, we covered the app installs. You also told us that how to retain a user on the app. So let's say if a digital marketer or an app owner wants to understand whether his or her app is doing well or not, what would be the important metrics that they should look out for?
Again, Kaushal, I think so. The first thing is to not look at any metric in its own, right? There are metric pairs that you can look at or understand what within the context of the setup, does this metric make sense for me or not? And that's the first thing you should keep in mind. The other is there are two types of basic metrics. The first is around acquisition. So when you're acquiring users, how efficiently are you acquiring those users, right? And that's the first set of acquisition metrics. So let's say cost per install, which is the most basic metric. It used to be really important earlier when installs were everything, but now people are moving away towards more deeper funnel or lower in the journey activities like, let's say, purchase or registration and so on. So what's my cost per registration is, let's say, a metric that is relevant for a lead-based business. Or what's my cost per transaction for an e-commerce company, or what's my cost per subscription for a OTT company. And the funny thing is, if you really were to take any three letters and create an acronym, there will most likely be a metric for app. There is DAU, which is daily active users. There is MAU, monthly actives. And really not being bogged down by each of these, but focusing on how effectively or efficiently are you acquiring the users. That's the first set. The second is around engagement. Once you've acquired them, how long are they engaging? How are they staying back, right? So this is where retention rates become important in the context of benchmarks, like I said earlier, for your industry. You could also look at uninstall rates. It's no good that if I spend 100 rupees to acquire 10 users and a month later, all of those 10 are gone and I'm left with zero again. So I think why are users uninstalling the app, uninstall rates and so on is the other one. And then there are really your deeper engagement metrics like average sessions per user or page depth, on how many pages did they visit inside the app before shutting it down. But to be honest, I think it's easy to get trapped in the whole metric optimization goal. What's really important is to look at a North Star metric and understand, if I am completely improving my business by at least one of these key metrics. And one of those common metrics is now the lifetime value, example. So if I have paid 100 rupees to acquire a user, is that user giving me back 101 rupees in their lifetime, which is, let's say, 6 months or 3 months or 1 month? If they are giving me back those value, then me spending that money is justified, right? Which is how marketing becomes efficient. And those questions are being asked a lot more to businesses in the context of COVID than ever before. Looking at not just the first touch point, which is an install or the first transaction, but really looking at the entire lifetime of the users is where I think a lot of us will start working on in the short and the midterm.
Yeah, and that would help them to understand what's the return on their initial investment in terms of gaining the user also. What is the lifetime value of that user?
Absolutely, Kaushal. You're right.
Perfect. And Rajat, over here, you mentioned about the benchmarks of the industry.
Mhm.
While you mentioned several metrics, and I understand that the benchmarks would be different for different industries, is there any source of information where, let's say, if a particular retailer wants to understand that, hey, what are the benchmarks for the retail industry or what are the benchmarks for the insurance industry, they could go and understand it?
So I think that's an important point, Kaushal. Thanks for bringing it up. A lot of what we do is dependent on industry reports to understanding how the ecosystem is moving towards. And there are a lot of players who publish these reports regularly. And these are providers who have presence across each of those. So let's say an attribution partner will publish their reports on across their apps. What have they seen the retention rates like? So what's
Mhm.
the average retention rate for D1, D7? And by D1, D7, I mean one day after the person installs the app or 7 days after they install the app. Similarly, there are push notification providers that provide their industry reports on how often do they see retention rates changing for each industry. So there are a few of these and they keep getting published quite frequently. If I were to put a name, I think AppsFlyer publishes one, which is a state of app marketing report. CleverTap has one that they publish quite frequently as well. App Annie is a good source which has, again, reports on the overall trends across apps and categories in India and globally as well. So I would say those three or four are the most common ones that you could look at.
Perfect. And Rajat, you brought up the word notifications over here. So that helps me to bring up this next question to you. That's one thing which usually I turn off on my phones because sometimes it becomes an irritation. But at the same time, there is a fear of missing out again on some of the important notification which happens.
Absolutely.
Some of the brands purposely stop the notifications when they see this user behavior that, okay, the user is not opening any notifications, but most of the other brands don't do it.
Mhm.
Is it a good practice to turn off the notifications from the brand side itself?
I think it's a good question, and there has to be a balance in this, like everything else. So,
Mhm.
what are you risking basically with a lot of notifications, right? The first is there could be, like you rightly mentioned, notification fatigue. So, I'm tired of looking at the same type of notification multiple times, so I don't even look at it, I dismiss it completely. In some cases, it even increases the uninstall rate because I did not realize that I was getting so many notifications. I might as well remove this app completely and install it later if I have the need. So there are those outcomes as well. And the other extreme, like you rightly said, is whether I want to do away with completely removing the notifications entirely. So I think the balance has to be somewhere in the middle so that it's useful for the users. At the same time, it's also not spammy. So for example, a lot of us depend on our order updates that they're out for delivery or shipping today and so on to understand, that what's the current status of my last shopping spree that I did late last night. That said, I think this is where again the paid marketing activities can complement your notifications. So, sorry,
Mhm.
one point I missed was notifications are comparatively cheaper as well, right? So that's why it's more efficient, at least from a cost perspective, if you're looking at a really short term. The paid marketing, on the other hand, like Google App Campaigns, for example, you have the option of setting a goal and then you realize that even outside of your app, if a user is spending time on YouTube, watching videos or on searching for something, and you have the option of taking or getting him back to your app then. So as long as the economics is working there, you could potentially also do complement your own media channels with a paid campaigns as well.
Perfect. And for the listeners, the app which I was mentioning of, or at least I like the user behavior of there in terms of notification, is Deep Stash. It's a really amazing app if you don't like listening to a book like me or reading a complete book. So Deep Stash is the app which you could explore and learn how they send the notifications. They stop the notifications if you do not respond to the notification after a particular point in time, and that's what I appreciate about them.
Interesting. So you've given me homework for the weekend. This is what I'm going to do tomorrow and day after.
Yeah, I read books maybe sometimes in 5 minutes, at least the summary of the book. So that really helps. You can gain lots of knowledge from this.
Yes.
Rajat, that brings me to the another question. While you told us about Firebase, and that's one of the tool which could be used for creating an app success story. Any other tools which you would recommend for app success?
There are about three or four buckets which one should look at for their app activities. The first is around attribution, which helps understand where are the users coming from. So I did 10 things. I sent an email, I sent an SMS, I ran Facebook campaigns, I ran Google campaigns, and 10 users came finally. What worked? And that's where attribution helps decide what's the right credit source for this activity. So that's first. The second is user analytics. Once they are on the app, what are they doing? How much time are they spending? What pages are they visiting? why are they going away? That's user analytics, building cohorts of users, understanding their patterns. That's the second most common XDK that you might want to have inside the app. The
Mm-hmm.
third is around marketing automation or some of the things that we discussed. So push notifications and so on. How do you power that from within the app? So if a user does action A, doesn't do action B, should we trigger a notification? And those kind of things is where marketing automation comes in. And the fourth really is more from a product standpoint where they would like to make better apps. And outside of Firebase, also there are other tools which might help you understand the user analytics and product analytics a little in detail. So that's, I think, the fourth bucket.
Nice. That's wonderful. Let's jump to App Store optimization. That's something which many of my clients ask for that, okay, can you help us with App Store optimization? Because we are more into the organic space. For the users who want to do App Store optimization, my first question over there, do you think it's an activity which should be done or it should not be done?
So I think definitely it's useful. And I think like the way it works for search engine, I think ASO works for apps as well. And there are categories where it works better and there are categories where it may not work as much, right? So, and while I am technically not an expert on App Store optimization, I think what I've seen as a more common practice is where the users are not really aware about the exact brand or the use case is where their search is more exploratory. So when I'm searching for, let's say the example of a gaming app, let's say I'm searching for a puzzle game. Now, I don't have a specific app in mind yet. So I want to look at multiple things. I want to look at different games and understand which one should I pick, which has got great ratings, which have more people installed, which sounds more exciting to me. This is just a hypothetical example, but I think it's relevant and it's useful, which is where the need for an expert around there is even higher. And apps overall are getting crowded, right? So like I think I mentioned earlier, there are about 2 million plus apps just on the Indian Play Store, if I'm not wrong. So that just means that the discoverability of each app becomes that much more difficult. So how do you, outside of spending monies and so on, make sure that you are reaching out to the right users when they are looking for you is useful.
Understood. And over there, while we witnessed multiple techniques and views from your side in terms of the app growth, any particular example of app growth which you would like to share with our audience?
So I think I can talk about two, and they're both quite recent actually. As you might know about the ban that our government did for the Chinese apps, and that led to the short video apps space becoming very, very active. And this is all in the last, I think, 1.5, 2 months, if I'm not wrong. So that just means that a lot of our developers, Indian developers, came up with apps within a short span of time, which was in the same space and kind of the same use case as largely what a TikTok was. They drove millions of installs every day. Even today, if you are listening to this in the month of August, you would see that most of the apps in the top ranking space on Play Store would really be around short video space. That just shows the amount of interest there is both from developers as well as consumers to try this set. And the second, of course, is just around the time of lockdown, all the grocery and OTT and EdTech apps saw a massive spike, right? So how many people do you know in your family today? This is a question to all of our listeners. How many people do you know in your families who have asked you a question around how do I use an EdTech app for my child or for my family member? And that's becoming so much more common, right? Because a lot of people are using more and more of apps like Byju's and so on to understand and teach their kids. So those are the two examples I would say.
Perfect. And yeah, on that particular question of yours, how many people around you have asked for EdTech? For me, it has been several. I can at least remember 10, 15 people doing that when you asked that particular question.
Absolutely. I think same for me. Every week I'll get a question on something to do with an EdTech app.
Perfect. The apps, you already shared some numbers and they've been doing really well. But where do you see the apps in the future? Let's say another 5 years down the line, what do you think is the future of apps in India?
So I think apps will definitely have evolved a lot from the last 12, 13 years since the launch. And I think they will be significantly different going ahead as well. There are a lot of connected devices which are coming in now. So you would have your entertainment apps on your TV, for example, right? And that's while an extension of what is called an app, but it will go beyond just being on your mobile phone. So let's say another example I could think of is something called as PWA or Progressive Web Apps and TWA, which is Trusted Web Activities. All again, three-letter nomenclatures, like I said before, but essentially making sure that users who are on the lower end devices or who don't have as much computing strength on their phones are also able to access and get the power of apps. So it will move beyond the really smartphone core that we are sitting on right now to a connected device on your TV or your wristwatch and your lower end devices as well.
Okay. You're saying that, okay, a PWA and app in terms of, let's say, Firebase app may not compete with each other, but yeah, they may go hand in hand in the near future.
Absolutely. I think the definition of apps will become a little more relaxed. And right now, it's strictly something which is a native app, but it's becoming more diluted every month, right? So PWA, for example,
Okay.
is where the M site becomes evolved, really gives additional capabilities and move one step closer to being an app. A trusted web activity, TWA, think of it as a wrapper around PWA. So you could actually drive campaigns for TWA, for example, which means that instead of having the users download a native app which takes space, 40, 50 MB, it is a much lighter and a smaller version. And it still does a chunk of what a complete app would do.
Great. Any good examples of PWA or TWA that you would like to share with the audience?
One is from Myntra, who has an app for a specific version which is lower than a specific Android OS version. So what Myntra wants is that anyone who's on a lower Android version will most likely be on a basic phone. They can also access Myntra as an app, and that's where TWA comes in. Similarly, I remember Oyo also, I think, has an app which is of a similar type, where in specific geos and specific areas, that makes more sense for the users than a complete native app.
Got it. And the user will have to do something very different for getting onto the TWA version, or just they go to the Play Store and type Myntra and they would get the version based on their phone type.
Yes, so there are parts to the distribution of the app that you could control. For example, you could say for a specific Android version, I want to show TWA instead of the native app.
Okay, fine. And that person would be, in fact, not installing the app on the phone, but would be accessing the app or the PWA version just via the internet itself.
Yes, so it's very close to the app experience. So it doesn't really feel like it's M site, but it's better user experience that way.
Yeah, it's actually a web experience which the person is having while they have an icon on the phone, but at least they will be able to access everything which is accessible via the web.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's quite a bit of information which you shared with us around the apps. Now let's share some more insights with the audience about you itself. So my first question over there would be in terms of who do you follow?
So I think I like to read a lot, and I keep looking at and bookmarking articles that I find interesting across LinkedIn, TechCrunch, and a lot of other blogs which are in the same tech space largely. Besides that, we spoke about industry reports, and I think those are a great source of understanding what's happening by the experts, right? So the App Annie or the AppsFire and CleverTap reports are again useful. Branch has also a great documentation around deep linking and so on. So understanding from these sources is really useful coming from the experts directly. Then there are people who are, of course, great thinkers and speakers. And what I like following these people is not just understanding the outcome, but what is their thought process behind this. So a lot of our users might know about Avinash Kaushik. He's a pretty famous blogger and writer on all things analytics. And every post that he writes has a lot of thought behind it. And I think that's really useful. However, I think there are a lot of other users who write great content, and it makes sense to follow them on LinkedIn at least to get a sense of what their thoughts are. And that's becoming more common now. I see a lot of our peers writing more often. And that's great because I think we need to do more as the industry to help our newcomers and folks who are joining this industry for the first time to really understand what's the best practices across. And that's where even podcasts like what you're doing, Kaushal, is a really great step.
Yes, and thanks to you for being on this show, which helps you also become a person who is sharing this much knowledge with the industry. Thanks for that. And Rajat, I was going through your LinkedIn profile and saw that over the last few years, you have really grown really fast from your stint at Flipkart and AppsFire and now to Google. You've grown really fast. So what makes you remain growth focused?
So I think I've just been lucky on at least the roles part to get the opportunity that I got. That said, I think in terms of the growth area, what I want to look at and what I do actively is focus on this one quote, which is actually from one of my ex-classmates who's now the CEO of a great nonprofit organization called 321 Foundation. His name is Gaurav Singh. And he used to use this quote in his teaching classes to underprivileged children a lot, which is, what am I going to do about it? And that's the quote, which basically puts you in a frame of mind where you're saying that, okay, I know there's a problem. I know there's an opportunity. First of all, how do I make it actionable? And second is, what is my role in this? The first thing I want to do is try and own a lot of problem statements as if they were my own. As if I'm spending money for a company, what if it was my own money? what am I going to do about it if it was my money? So really owning is, I think, one part. And the second is to work backwards from an ideal outcome. If you're thinking about a completely undefined or unsolved problem, what is the ideal state where you would want to be in a little while down the line, and how do you work backwards from there, right? So mapping each step backward till the point you feel is realistically achievable is where growth again can come from.
Perfect. And Rajat, let's take my favorite question, which I ask each of the growth genius who's there on the show.
Mhm.
If you could time travel at this minute to the beginning of your career when you had just stepped into the corporate world,
Mhm.
what would be the suggestion you will give yourself to your younger self?
That's an interesting one. So I think if I could time travel, maybe the first thing I would do is take a pit stop 6 months back from now and try to stop the pandemic and tell people that they should be more cognizant and be wearing more masks. But jokes aside, I think if I were to time travel, maybe what I would do is tell myself really early on to find good mentors. And I think mentors help us become a much better version of ourselves than we would get there, but we might take longer. So find the right kind of mentors that you think are willing to help out, seek their help. And I
Mhm.
tell myself that, find a mentor for each of these areas. So let's say find a mentor for analytics, understanding of data. Find a mentor who could help you with public speaking, for example. Find a mentor
Mhm.
who helps you understand how to perform or use a tool much better way than you today are using, right? So I think learning from people is the easiest and the most efficient way. And I would tell myself to do more of that.
Perfect. That's very true. And names of any mentors of yours which you would like to share with the audience?
So I think there are quite a few. There are mentors at each level. My first manager was Deepak Kolinjewadi. He was a super helpful, super interesting person who understood what each person skills were and nurture them in the right way. That was definitely one. I think Google has a lot of such folks as well. So they may or may not be seniors or they may be your peers, but understanding from each of them, given their strength, is what kind of has helped me.
Perfect. And any advice for the listeners who specifically want to work at Google? What should they do to be at least qualified or crack the interview at Google?
So I think I would say the first thing to know is that how does Google evaluate, or what are the key aspects of the interview process that anyone looks at? And there are broadly four categories, right? The first is role related knowledge. So of course, how well do you understand the role that you are being hired for from a technical perspective or from a business perspective and so on. But that's only one fourth of the skills really that is being looked at. The other three are leadership, which means have you taken initiatives and how have you gone beyond the basic or the expectations of the role to really deliver performance. The third is general cognitive ability. So if you were put in, let's say, a new situation which you haven't seen before or a different problem area than what you've been working on, how well are you able to frame your thoughts and come up with an approach that is more realistic, practical, and solvable? And the last is really googliness, which is a term used often within Google. That
Mhm.
how's the culture fit, right? So are you helpful? Do you understand the culture at Google? Are you in a frame of mind that is more growth focused in general? So I think that's the fourth bucket. And the other bit is to really reach out to any Googler that you have interacted with in the past is another advice. I think I find a lot of people at Google are significantly helpful and are willing to guide others. So if you think you have a connection with someone, reach out to them, ask them for inputs, and that definitely helps.
Perfect. That's really good. Thanks for sharing. So, Rajat, what we are going to do next is step into the speed it round. So, I would request you to keep the answers for these questions really short, maybe a few words.
Okay. Do I get a hamper at the end?
Definitely, we could do that. We could courier it across to you.
I'm just joking. Go ahead, Kaushal.
Yeah. One question over there. While you already gave us that really interesting quote, which I am unable to remove from my mind, what am I going to do about it? Would you term that itself as the quote that you live by, or there is something else?
I think that's the code that I really like. And I think it makes me look internally a little bit more and makes me more action oriented. So, yes, what am I going to do about it is the code that I would live by.
Yeah, and that was something which would stay in my mind as well. Thanks a lot for sharing it. If not digital, what would you be doing?
I think teaching. I think I really like concept of helping others understand the topic in detail. So definitely teaching.
Okay, that's your googliness factor. Which one habit has been a game changer for you?
So I think there's this saying called eat your frog first thing in the morning, which is try and address the most difficult problem early on.
Mhm.
And that's
Yeah,
something that I try to do more.
I'm a big fan of this book as well. Thanks for it, sharing it. One thing that you want to correct in your life.
Give back more. I've realized multiple times in the last few months that while I've been more fortunate, I haven't really done my part on helping others in any way I could. And I think that's one area which I want to really get more into.
Great. And you're already doing that by sharing so much on this particular show. Thank you. How do you define Rajat Srivastava in one word?
One word would be curious, just to understand how things work. Why do brands behave the way they do? Why do consumers make the decisions that they do? And right now, what I'm curious about is what's in the fridge that I can go
Ah,
and eat after this.
yeah, I've been holding you for this conversation for long.
No, and just joking. I think that's a thought which is most often in our minds right now as we're staying home. So it's a habit now.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'll just not stop you more from going to your fridge and checking what's there. But yeah, few things before we end the show is how does the audience stay connected with you?
LinkedIn is the best platform. I'm reachable on LinkedIn and try to respond to your messages and queries in any way.
Perfect. So they can search for Rajat Srivastava and they should be able to find you.
Yes,
Perfect.
my ID is also Rajat SRI. If you were to search for that as the profile ID, you would find me.
Perfect. Thank you. Any parting thoughts that you would like to share with our audience?
I think just one quick recap on the app marketing and how I see working closely in this domain is that it's really a confluence of hardcore technical skills, which is how do you use your tools and platforms and so on. It's a love for data, so you need to understand Excels and pivot tables in any way that you can. And really the third is around creativity. So while you have the data and the numbers and everything else, what language do the consumers speak and how do you talk to them in their languages? Something which I think is interesting in this space. And if you are looking to work towards long-term career in the app space, I think either pick one of these three or look at a kind of a coverage around all of these three would definitely help you.
Perfect. That's good. Thanks a lot, Rajat, for being on the show. We learned a lot, especially I'm going back and implementing some of the techniques which I had learned while reading that book, Eat That Frog. And yes, I'm also going to take up all the challenges which are in front of me and I'm going to ask them, what am I going to do about it?
Thanks again for having me, Kaushal. It was wonderful speaking to you. And I really like the fact that what you're doing outside of your core area to help some of the folks within the industry is really commendable. Thanks again for that.
Thank you, Rajat. It was a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Growth Genius. I hope you learned something today that would help you to grow. If you did, please share this episode with your friends and family. If you are listening to the show on the Infidigit website, I would request you to use the podcast app or on iPhone or download Google Podcast or Spotify on your Android phone. Subscribing to this podcast will ensure that you get the episodes regularly on your phone. The podcast icons near the audio streaming widget should help you navigate to this show on your podcast app. Also, if you haven't yet subscribed to The Growth Genius, please subscribe wherever you are listening to this show. Thank you so much for listening. Now go out there